Hello and welcome to The Pouch, the pork barrel of podcasts that aims to help the average Aussie try and make sense of their current political environment. I'm Greg. I have mixed feelings about this rain savage.
And I'm Jake, crispy submariner Far Wharton. On today's episode, we give you your essential as water weekly roundup of Australian political news. And of course, Greg asks the tough questions.
Jake, this week, I want to know, why on earth do we have the Westminster system here in Australia? There are so many other systems, political systems out there. What led to us having the Westminster system?
And we also bring you up to speed on the whereabouts of Julia Gillard. Well, we have some interesting news this week. First up, Scott Morrison has seen his first opinion poll of the year, and it's not so great for him. It's he's been overtaken as preferred Prime Minister, Greg, by Anthony Albanese in the first published opinion poll of 2020. Of course, he only won the election a few months ago, so it's pretty quick to be dipping into the red. Labor is now in front on a two-party preferred basis, 51 to 49, and that is a significant turnaround when you consider that early in December the coalition led 52 to 48.
But I suppose it's not too surprising, is it? You know, given the amount of negative media that Scott Morrison has received about, his handling of the bushfire crisis, everything from handshakes to not doing enough to doing too much. The public discourse has really been around whether or not Scott Morrison himself is doing a good job. So, if someone asks you whether or not you think he's doing a good job, it's you're probably going to say, well, not really at the moment. I can see it. I can see it changing down the track, but at the moment, it shouldn't be too surprising that he has taken that hit in the polls. Definitely,
and Labor's response, very, very quick and of course media savvy response was to essentially say that his performance, Morrison's performance through the crisis, had shown that he was, quote, loose with the truth and, quote, disinterested in the national interest. But as you say, these things, he might take an initial hit and then they may take a turnaround over time. But
how are these polls taken, Jake? How do people do that? Is it a phone call? Or do people come up to you in the street?
Different polls are collected differently. Most of them are phoned polls. So essentially a polling organisation, Guardian has one, Essential has one, Newspoll has one. I think actually Newspoll outsourced now to Essential. But essentially there are these different polling organisations. They'll call their core group of respondents each time and ask them key questions. And having that key or that core group of people is essential to understand how their votes change over time or how their opinions change over time. You can quantitatively analyse how things are changing rather than just getting sort of licking your finger and putting it out into the air and seeing who thinks what at this time. So it's the polling is I think a well-controlled quantitative thing. But again, as we saw at the last election, you can't always trust a good poll, but it is always interesting in terms of how it's used on the political side. That's quite interesting because we've discussed previously the interplay between how polls, particularly opinion polls of a particular prime minister, have taken a hit and then soon the action of the political party has been to either question the leadership or outright depose that prime minister.
Yeah, well, all the while saying on the news, polls don't matter.
Yeah.
We're not paying any attention to these polls whatsoever.
The tried and true one is the only poll that matters is the election poll, Greg.
Well, based on the last election, that's
absolutely true. That's a rather accurate one.
Jake, I know that one of the election promises last election was around the NDIS, the National Disabilities Insurance Scheme, which aimed to, put the money back into the hands of the people who needed it and for them to be able to make some decisions about where they get their services from. But it's made the news this week.
Yes, it has, and not for any good reasons, unfortunately. So the head or the minister in charge of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, as you say, or the NDIS, Stuart Robert, he's a Gold Coast native here in Queensland, but he, during an interview this week, and the interview was essentially following news or reports rather of an extraordinary number of deaths during a Senate estimates inquiry. While essentially deaths related to waiting for the NDIS or waiting for enrolment on the NDIS. So during an interview this week, Stuart Robert was questioned about this figure, which is 1,279 people have died, apparently while waiting for their NDIS payments to kick in. So essentially, the minister said that no one has died while waiting for the NDIS. However, that figure of 1,279 was provided as evidence during Senate estimates. So it seems that is not correct. And I suppose, aside from the fact that it is a nationally, it is a nationwide scheme, which is incredibly important to those living with a disability. The federal government has apportioned some of the funds that were allocated to the NDIS to the bushfire relief and the bushfire infrastructure fund that has been announced in the last couple of weeks.
All right, Jake, so not forgetting about our friends down there in Tasmania, we've had a resignation this week. We've had a high-profile resignation. Is that right?
That's right, Greg. While eaters of the fine Arnott's biscuit shapes have been greeted with the premise that you can find Tasmania in every box. It seems that Tasmanian Premier Will Hodgman has said that he no longer wants to find Tasmania anywhere. No, I'm being too hyperbolic. He essentially he's led his party, his political party, to 2 election wins, and he's now 2 years into his current term, which is halfway through the 4-year term, or he's essentially been in power now for 6 years, and he's decided essentially that he no longer wants to be in government anymore, and likely will not contest his seat at the next election. And this is important because he has been a mainstay, aside from obviously being the leadership of the Liberal Party in Tasmania, he's been a mainstay of Tasmanian politics for the last 20 years. So he is a bit of a powerhouse there. But
so he, like, generally speaking, he's quite a well-respected politician down there.
Yeah, broadly speaking, he's well-respected within both his party and in Tasmania in general. Strategically, I would point out that this is actually probably a really good move. He's two years into this current term, and it does give the opportunity for a new leader, essentially 2 full years to prepare both, to make their agenda clear and make their policies clear, but also prepare for the next election.
Absolutely. And we know that Australians have got, change of leader fatigue, if you will. So to have 2 years to get to know someone and to hear their policies and to find out a bit more about them, certainly I imagine that it will do them some favours at their next election as well.
Speaking of elections, though, it's quite interesting. Last federal election, it's been found that Bridget McKenzie, the current deputy leader of the Nationals and current agriculture minister, during the lead up to the election, she was then the sports minister, has been accused of a rather brazen form of pork barreling. Actually, putting the term brazen and pork barreling in the same sentence sounds freaking delicious, Greg.
It does, especially since I haven't had breakfast yet. But look, I think that, this term pork pork barreling has come up a fair bit. It's probably going to be one of those things that is just thrown at you and you're going to be expected to understand what it means. What does pork barreling mean, Jake?
So I spent some time yesterday looking up the etymology of the term pork barreling.
Yeah, okay.
And
you would have a very colourful Google search history, I do imagine, and this is just added to it.
Yeah, exactly. Not safe for work. No, I'm only kidding. But it's quite interesting actually. Pork barreling is a term in the political circles that we use to describe when politicians propose programs. How's that for alliteration? That will favourably impact a town or electorate where they're hoping to gain or at least not lose votes. So an example of that might be, say in this example, where a town or a township or an electorate where, say, the current political party in power is hoping not to lose votes, they might say put, a few $100,000 into change room sheds for a local rugby field.
And if I've got it right, Jake, if I've got this story right, some of the applications that were put in didn't meet a threshold, but they were approved anyway.
Well, you say some, Greg, but some implies maybe 20%, 30% maybe, or even less, depending on sort of your threshold. We're talking about 73% of the approved projects not being recommended essentially by the independent body here, Sports Australia. So I think it's probably important to put in context that pork barreling is done by everyone, okay? It's something
I'm doing it now. I'm doing it.
Exactly. We're providing good content in order for listeners to continue listening. Look, pork barreling is a political mainstay. It's not something that generally speaking is looked upon poorly because everybody wants stuff, particularly if you're in a marginal electorate.
It's not a dirty word as such.
Well, look, in the Bible, pork is certainly a dirty meat, but generally speaking, it's something that everybody does. It is something that is accepted at least. But the issue here is that it was particularly brazen. I did mention, and in fact, the Auditor General looking at this particular scheme has found again 73% of the approved projects had not been recommended by the independent body that verifies the need for these things.
I also listened to an episode of the AM podcast the other day from ABC, and I think they mentioned in that, I had to listen to it a couple of times. It's one of those stories that just sort of crept up on me, and I had to listen to what was going on a few times. I think this one in particular, they said that part of the criteria for getting approved is that the project shouldn't have already started, nor should it be completed. And I think a certain percentage of these projects were already started, and some of them were actually already done. Yeah. So they were getting money for projects that hadn't even, that didn't need it at all.
Yeah, which sounds great, frankly.
Gosh, you're not going to knock that back, are you?
Exactly. No, I won't say no. No, and it's probably also important to point out that no laws have been implied broken, in this, but it is.
So this is not illegal.
It's not illegal to pork barrel. It's not illegal.
Okay. So what we're talking about is really just that. Hey, these weren't recommended for this grant. These projects weren't recommended for this grant, but they've gone ahead and done it anyway. But it's not illegal.
As with any implementation of any broad amount of money, the government will set up a governance around that, particularly around the implementation of a large amount of money, and in this case we're talking about $100 million, and they're handed out essentially as grants. So the governance that was built around that had an independent assessor, which in this case again was Sport Australia, and essentially bypassing the Sport Australia recommendation does not constitute doing something illegal. It's not great. It is thought of as brazen, as I mentioned in the opening here.
That's the word of the day.
It is indeed. But invariably, the Auditor General has not found that it is that any laws have been broken.
Right. So I can keep going with my pork barreling here.
Well, please do, because I'm getting hungrier by the second.
So I don't need to keep my curtains closed while I'm doing my pork barreling?
No.
Okay. All right, Jake, while we are snug as a bug in a rug, I have a question for you that's been burning in my mind for a long time. And I want to know today, what is the Westminster system and why do we have it?
Well, okay, I'm going to correct you first. It's called the Westminster system.
Jeez.
Which I reckon, because, the whole premise of this podcast is, Greg, you're the average Australian.
That's
I
right.
reckon everybody else is saying Westminster system.
Yeah.
But actually, Greg, when you proposed this as a topic, I thought, nobody's going to want to talk about the Westminster system. But I actually started looking into it, and it's fascinating.
Okay.
It is
All right,
actually,
well, hit me.
Or at least
what is the Westminster system?
Well, first of all, thank you for pronouncing it correctly. my
It's like that sauce. What's that sauce? Worcestershire.
Worcester sauce. Yeah, exactly. But my pedantry senses are completely validated now. But the Westminster system is essentially the system that the Australian government and, in fact, many, if not all of our states and territories have subsequently adopted as well. It is just a system. There are other systems. Look, from my perspective, it probably beats the Electoral College system and the system of governance that the American Constitution has. But broadly speaking, there are many systems, and this is just the system that Australia was essentially founded upon.
What's its purpose? What's the purpose of the Westminster system? Why does it trump other systems?
Broadly speaking, all it does is it sets up a system for governance. We have a Senate, we have a House of Representatives, we have the sectors of the government. We have the federal government, we have the state government, and we have the local governmental councils. So it sets out broadly speaking, an array of or a broad infrastructure for Australia to govern around, and it differs from the originators of the original Westminster system, which is England, in Westminster, where
Westminster's a place.
Yeah, well, is it a place or is it just a building? But
you're the one telling. You're meant to be educating me, Jake.
It's in London. Okay, it's in London. It's Westminster.
So Westminster is a building in London.
It is a building in London. It's
right.
It's
not a place.
Exactly. It's the big
you
House
don't
of
live
Parliament.
at Westminster.
Well, you could, but I hear the toilets leak actually. But no, so it's in England. It's the big Parliament building in England. Interestingly enough, only some of these states have a Senate to approve laws. New South Wales, for example, they have a Senate. Queensland doesn't have a Senate. So
there you go.
Yeah, there you go, indeed. So within our Australian constitution, as it pertains to the Parliament, we've had several updates over the years. We've had women's suffrage, so the ability for women to vote that was enabled in 1902. Compulsory voting. Australia has compulsory voting, which is one of the mainstays of one of the cornerstones, if you like, of the Australian electoral system. Is essentially everyone who is registered to vote must vote in every election. That was enabled in 1924. Unfortunately, we don't have, Indigenous Australian suffrage was only added in 1983. In terms of our hierarchy as well, when questions of constitutionality of things come up, they are referred to the High Court for consideration and judgment. And at the very pointy figurehead end of the whole Westminster system is the Governor General. They're essentially they're appointed by the government of the time, but they are seen as the formal chain of command, albeit ceremonial, from Australia. Essentially, they are the Queen's representative, and they have the final say per se.
Yeah.
They have the final say in every bit of legislation.
Ah, there you go. And now it's time for Where in the World is Julia Gillard? Jake, Where is Julia Gillard? I stopped reading Women's Weekly a few months ago, and I presume that she's been on the cover about 4 or 5 times since then. That was sort of the last that I remember about Julia Gillard, was her sort of foray into media interviews. I know that she was quite an influential leader as well. Our first female prime minister. Where is she now? What is she doing?
Yeah, a little bit of history on Julia Gillard. She was Australia's 27th Prime Minister, as well as you said, she was our first woman Prime Minister. She deposed Kevin Rudd in 2010 following a series of disagreements, mainly over the mineral resource rent tax, or AKA, as it was known at the time, the mining tax. Yes. She led the party through an election win. It was a very, very close race, resulting essentially in neck and neck. So the same number of, so essentially nobody was able to take the lead after that election. She, however, made a number of alliances with the Greens and with independent politicians in order to form what's known as a minority government, or a hung parliament as well. So despite leading that hung parliament through that alliance, her government actually passed several key, very progressive policies and services, including environmental policies, economic policies around health and education. Greg, you might recall the Gonski scheme that was brought in by Julia Gillard. She was previously, when she was in opposition, she was the opposition education spokesperson. So she had a long-term interest in education and certainly brought that forward. In 2013, after 2 unsuccessful challenges, she lost a third with Kevin Rudd, previously the Prime Minister, reascending to the field of Prime Minister. She immediately resigned and has since moved into more of a mentoring role, particularly in women's leadership, which is awesome. And around mental health. She's currently the chair of Beyond Blue, an Australian charity around.
Is she?
Yeah, she is, absolutely.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
Yeah, around mental health. Yeah, no, she's a pretty awesome person. She's also chair of the Global Foundation for Education, again, keeping that education route strong. She's also chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College in London, and you might you might, as a fine purveyor of podcasts, you might want to check out her podcast, A Podcast of One's Own, with Julia Gillard. It's a pretty cool podcast. So,
all right, well, there you go. So that's a way that people can keep up to date with what she's doing. She's got her own podcast, and okay, all right. Well, gosh, she seems very busy. It's really great to hear when these politicians continue to serve, isn't it? Because you cop so much flack when you're in government, you cop so much flack when you're elected, and to hear that, despite everything and despite all of the nasty things that have been said to you, and maybe the nasty things that you've done, you've continued to serve. And it sounds like she's doing a great job out there and in chairing these committees, in championing women's rights still, and still serving the community that she's vowed to serve.
But broadly speaking, where is she today? She's not a very public person, while, as you say, she does chair a number of boards and she is active in some circles. But there is very little information about where she resides, apart from retaining her existing house that she had in her former electorate in outer Melbourne in Victoria.
Well, thank you, Jake. Thank you today for talking to me about pork barrelling in particular.
Brazen pork barrelling, nonetheless.
Brazen pork barrelling. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Like I say, before I've had breakfast.
Thanks very much, Greg. Always tremendous fun researching the topics for the podcast and keeping abreast of the news. But for our listeners, thank you very much for listening. Hit the subscribe button and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook by searching for The Pouch, the podcast.
That's right. If you want your friends to listen, you can direct them to thepouchthepodcast.com. And in case you missed it, we do have a bonus episode, which I threw together yesterday. I was really happy with it. We went down to Circular Quay to interview some of the protesters down there and just find out what they wanted from their recent protests, what they would like. So our first episode in a series called "What Do You Want?" and just interviews with people who were down there, fired up enough to go out with their placards and to protest some of the recent government decisions about bushfires and a myriad other things as well, apparently.
Yeah. Spoiler alert, it's all very articulate and incredibly reasonable.
That's right. That's what we aim for here, articulate and reasonable. Thank you so much, Jake. I look forward to speaking with you again next week. Oh, that's all right. Look, what is a podcast if not a chance to say the word brazen 14 times? Yeah, we gotta lap this up while we can.
Yeah.
All right.